Margie, I think you could start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see everyone here, though I don't see you. I'm Rabbi Margie Sloan, the Rabbi of West End Temple in Neponset, Queens, New York, for another 8 days. I am the spouse of your speaker this afternoon, and I will, in theory, be doing the admin on this call. Heaven help us. Our presentation will be webinar style, which means that you will be muted during the entire presentation. Our presenter, Ken Stern, will speak for about 25 minutes, and then he will answer questions via your chat box. So if you have any questions.
Not chat, but the Q&A. There's a Q&A box.
Excuse me, I take that back. I think it's Friday night. If you have any questions, put it in the Q&A box, and we'll see that Ken Stern gets them. Thank you to Peter Shackman for having your office design the nice flyer for this afternoon's presentation. And thank you to my colleagues of small congregations for partnering in bringing this program to your congregants. I will share a shortened bio of Ken. Kenneth S. Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and an attorney and award-winning author. For 25 years, he was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism, and he was also the lead drafter of the working definition of anti-Semitism. He has argued before the Supreme Court of the United States and testified before Congress, and he is a frequent guest on television and radio. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Forward. His newest book is The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, which I said he could plug for a minute or two. And so thank you, Ken, for being here this afternoon. And I'm going to give you the thrill of your life. Ken, would you please mute me now?
Yeah, Margie, you're very talented. You can mute yourself.
Oh, I can. Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thank you. And the biggest thing on my resume is I'm married to the most wonderful woman who's going to be emerita in 8 days, and that makes me, what, an emeritus Rebbitzin. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to the discussion. As you can imagine, I have a place in my heart for the small congregations. So it's important for me to be able to chat with you, especially since, you know, in some of the smaller places you may have problems that are not the same as you would have in Temple Emmanuel and places like that. So to start off, I wanted to give some feedback to some thoughts that Margie had shared with her too, which I thought were important, but I wanted to put into context. I mean, some people suggested, well, maybe we shouldn't have this webinar on anti-Semitism, precisely because of the things that have happened in the last few weeks in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And to me, it actually says the opposite, that it's important for an opportunity to think about hatred writ large, because we tend to silo things. We think about systemic racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia or so forth. And when we do that and see them as entirely distinct phenomena that aren't related to each other, we miss a lot of what's really important about each of them. So just to give you something to think about as I go through how to understand about hate and anti-Semitism in relation to it, just think about two events. The Tree of Life massacre at the synagogue in Pittsburgh a little over a year ago, everyone would classify that as an instance of anti-Semitism. No one would classify the shooting of Mexican immigrants and Mexican citizens at the Walmart in El Paso as an anti-Semitic incident. But if you track the ideologies and the motivations of those two shooters, they were practically the same. They may have reasons for choosing the different targets, but they came out of the same worldview. And to see one is entirely distinct from the other, I think misses a bunch of important things. We need to have somewhat of a broader lens as we're looking at all these issues of hatred, anti-Semitism among them. Let me step back for a couple of minutes and talk about the idea of hate studies. So you could see the reference of what I'm doing at the Bard Center and why it's relevant to what we're talking about today. As Margie said, for 25 years, I was the director on anti-Semitism at the American Jewish Committee, and one of the things that I was really honored to do was to work with a lot of grassroots groups around the country, particularly those in smaller communities. And one of them that I worked with directly was a group called the Northwest Coalition that was based in the Pacific Northwest. It was created by Margie's going to adjust the light. She's very good on surfaces. I'm not. Anyway, so Bill Wasmith, there you go. Thank you, sweetie. Bill Wasmith was the director of this group that was fighting against the neo-Nazis in the Pacific Northwest. You may recall that there was a group called the Aryan Nations that was very active. It was firebombing and threatening, and so a neo-Nazi group. So Wasmith, who had his house firebombed by these guys, put together this group that was active in the Pacific Northwest against hatred. And he invited me to give a talk at one of their conferences, and he challenged me to challenge them to do something that they weren't doing. And the thing that occurred to me was that what he was doing and what I was doing, what ADL was doing, what La Raza and the NAACP, all these groups, we were doing things that we thought were effective, but there was no connection with the academic world to tell us, was this working, wasn't this working? How do we think through and create testable theories to combat hate? So out of those discussions, there was an institute that was founded in Spokane, Washington at Gonzaga University called the Institute for Hate Studies, which has been going on for about 20 years now and has a conference, and it has a journal that comes out annually. But it hasn't really been able to transform the academy in the way that we were envisioning. So the Bard Center, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end, is an effort to do that. One of the things that we're doing that I want to mention specifically to this group is that in response to the pandemic, we changed our on-campus public programs to webinars, which has one advantage, which is that many more people can attend. And I'll send everybody on who signed up today an invitation. A week from today, I don't know how many people saw the viral Antisemitism in Four Mutations PBS film, but Andrew Goldberg, who was the filmmaker who made that, and I was an advisor to that film, he kindly agreed to let us show it, and then he'll do a Q&A. So I just wanted to mention that as something for this particular audience. Anyway, let me step back and talk about anti-Semitism and hate. And I want to bring you back to not this past Yom HaShoah where everything was virtual, but the one before that. I spoke at two Yom HaShoah events two springs ago. And remember the timing. It was a few months after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting and just days after the shooting at the Chabad synagogue in Poway. And I started off both of those Yom HaShoah talks with condensed sentences from John Ernest's manifesto. He was the Poway shooter who posted online shortly before the attack why he was doing what he was doing. And he justified his attacks the way most anti-Semites who commit acts of terror justify their acts. He said it was really just self-defense. So this is part of what he said. He asked, what value does my life have compared to the entirety of the European race? Is it worth it for me to live a comfortable life at the cost of an international Jewry sealing the doom of my race? Every Jew is responsible for the meticulously planned genocide of the European race. Every Jew, young and old, for these crimes, they deserve nothing but hell. So before I spoke at one of those two events, there were Hebrew school students that were reading clips. There were ones from then recent anti-Semitic hate crimes and images of synagogues tagged with graffiti and so forth, here and abroad, and then ones from the Nazi era. And I couldn't tell if the students were making a comparison, if their teachers were stressing as they were making the comparison, if these teachers were stressing the differences, that the Nazi attacks on Jews were sponsored by a state, or here, they were single people motivated by hate or small groups. At the second talk, they showed a clip from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is a fine short video on hate and anti-Semitism. But that raises the question, especially since the Holocaust Museum talks about, but really, what is the relationship? And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So when I was at AJC, groups like AJC and ADL and others rightly complained when there was an anti-Semitic attack and the condemnation was of a generalized racism or hatred generally. And I remember specifically when attacks started happening in France in the early 2000s, the French officials were saying, well, this is just hooliganism. Well, why was it just that synagogues were being attacked and not mosques and churches? It was an attempt to disguise anti-Semitism, to render it invisible, to homogenize it into some larger form of hatred. So that's something we have to be aware about. But the other side of the equation, to me, is the more important, because if you look historically, it's not as if anti-Semitism is the only type of hatred or it sits outside of the human capacity to hate. And when we think about it that way, again, we have blinders on, and I think it imperils our thinking about what we do about it. So think about hatred, regardless of where, regardless of when, regardless of the political or economic system, or any other variable, we've always had the capacity to define an us and a them, and for hatred to be stoked and to grow. Doesn't matter any of these variables, it's part of the human condition. We may need help about figuring out who to hate and the mechanisms of hate, but the instinct is there. And we don't really pull together the fields from the academic community that give us insight into various different subcomponents of that in the way that I think we should. And the model that I talk about is it's a human condition that people get sick. So medicine is a combination of biology and chemistry and physics and so forth. Or architecture, people need structures. We pull together from art and physics, math, and so forth to give answers to these questions. We don't do that as much as we should with hatred. And that's the idea of looking at hatred as a subject and anti-Semitism as a subcomponent. Hate studies is defined as inquiries into the human capacity to define and then dehumanize or demonize an other, and the processes which inform or give expression to or can curtail, control, or combat that capacity. Let me repeat that. Inquiries into the human capacity to define and then to dehumanize or demonize and quote other, and the processes which inform or give expression to or can curtail, control, or combat that capacity. There's lots of evidence, which I'll go through just very briefly, some highlights of it, that we really are programmed to see in us and in them. And this is the one segue. I'll take Margie's invitation to talk about the book, which is about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the campus debate. But the first chapter in the book, before I get into the meat of the different narratives and what's happening and not happening on campuses, is a chapter called Thinking About Thinking. And it's pulled from hate studies and some of what I'm going to talk the next couple of minutes about, but really looks at what happens to human thinking when especially when our identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice, and when groups are seen as this other in competition. And I think having some awareness of how we all react as humans when we're engaged in discussions about these issues or thinking about hatred generally is an important thing. So there's brain science in this, which is really amazing. When I started working on this 20 years ago, there was nothing really there that at least I knew of. But now you can put people into an MRI, and people that they hate versus people that they don't hate, the different parts of the brain fire differently. There are flashes of people of different races, different parts of the brain flash. It's not that the racism is part of the the brain that we can't change in some ways, but that's how we're used to identifying who's us and who's them. I commend to you a webinar I had done for the center a few weeks ago by Robert Sapolsky on hate and the brain, which goes into this in great detail in a very presentable way. So there's brain science that tells us that we're primed to have our brain function in the way fire, different ways respond to hatred. There's evolutionary psychology. There's a guy named Jim Waller who wrote a landmark piece for the Journal of Hate Studies, and what he pointed out, among many other things, just to pick one snippet, is if you think rationally about it, we should all be more afraid of automobiles than snakes and spiders. Automobiles are likely to cause us or our loved ones death and harm. Snakes, spiders, not so much a probability, but we all know, or at least most of us do, about how we react viscerally to ideas of snake or spiders, but we don't react that way to an automobile. Part of that is how our psychology is influenced by our evolution. There's social psychology that also tells us a lot about this too. I could take this group, if we were in a real room together, and maybe people could do it in a virtual room too, flip a coin, divide the group into heads or tails, A or B, one group or another group, totally random. Everybody recognizes that this is a random selection. After group identities are formed, people tend to think their group is smarter, their group is better, their group is more attractive. We're just sort of programmed to think about our group that way. So there's a lot more about this, about how people think about their world and the defining an us and a them. But the point is that in this human instinct to see the world this way, anti-Semitism fits perfectly. It is a classic us versus them. At heart, anti-Semitism is conspiracy theories, right? It's conspiracy theory about Jews trying to harm non-Jews. And it also, if you look historically, provides an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. It happens on the political left and it happens on the political right. Now, there are different types of anti-Semitism, and it's sort of artificial to define them this way, but I think it's helpful, at least to me, to think about them, even though there's overlaps and no really bright lines. The oldest, of course, is the religious-based anti-Semitism. You can probably go back, as Margie will tell me later, way before the time of Jesus. But if you started at the time of Christianity, Jews rejected Jesus. There was this universally accepted truth. And here's this group of people that says, not us, we don't believe it. Well, if you believe that this is what's important, it's the essence of your relationship to the world, what do you do with a group of people who reject your common narrative, your common values, your common symbols, especially when it's in religious terms? So the example, since Jews didn't disappear, was to sort of make them disappear as an example of what happens when you reject the general view of society. So Jews were kept in ghettos, they were discriminated against, they were expelled. You had the Crusades, you had the Inquisition. You had the blood libel. Again, us versus them, things that go wrong in the world. Jews conspiring to harm non-Jews, allegedly taking, a Christian child disappears around Easter time. It's the Jews who did it. They did it for religious purposes. Jews poison wells during the time of the Black Plague. Again, it's us versus them. Here's this group there that's harming us, and it explains the calamity that people are facing. So that's the oldest type of anti-Semitism. More recent is the racial-based anti-Semitism, post-Darwin, when, at least in theory beforehand, when Jews were seen as a religion, you could convert out, and it didn't always work out that well. Look at what happened in Spain, but at least in theory you could. Once Jews were seen as a race, once it was something, a matter of blood passed down from parent to child to grandchild and so forth, that became something you couldn't convert from. And Nazism was, again, the same thing. But if you look at the writings of the Nazis, it was, again, the us versus them. Here's this outside group that's trying to attack us. We're just protecting ourselves from these evil Jews. And you had even before the Nazis, you had the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Jews controlling the world, promoted by mainstream figures like Henry Ford. So you have, again, the same conspiracy theory and explanation. The most difficult, and that's something for another day, I talk about it some in my book about the conflict over Israel-Palestine, but is anti-Semitism related to Israel. And the key points is that some are on the left are blind to anti-Semitism within their community, and some on the right are blind to anti-Semitism within their community around issues of Israel. There's a lot of moral psychology that tells us that when people feel firmly attached to an issue like this, and it defines part of their identity, we especially are susceptible to try to backfill our thinking. We have this vision and we're trying to sustain it and to reject anything that might cause us to reconsider. And some of that is happening around the Israel-Palestine debate, especially around sacred symbols and identities and senses of justice. That said, there are clearly some examples where there is anti-Semitism, again, conspiracy theory and explanations of the things that go wrong in the world around Israel. And the easiest one to see, of course, is the world will be better off without Jews, the world will be better off without Israel. So how do we think about anti-Semitism, especially since the narrative continues to be that, at least in recent time, that anti-Semitism is rising? Well, I think it's important to step back and think about how we think about that. What exactly do we mean? How can we gauge anti-Semitism at any particular moment? And again, I think it's distorting to do so in isolation without looking at the larger field of how hatred works, and of course without any historical reference. So part of what we usually do when we think about it is looking at hate crimes, or hate crimes up. You know, year to year, they sort of vary, generally over the last few years. But if you look at the data, it still shows that even with incorporating Pittsburgh and Poway and what happened in Brooklyn last year and with the attacks on the street for a few weeks, that the tendency is that hate crimes against Jews tend to be property-based, against swastikas on synagogues or things in cemeteries, whereas if you're a transgender person or Muslim or so forth, it's more likely to be physical. Okay, so that's one part, hate crimes, looking at that, but again, putting in a larger context. Attitudes. What do people think about Jews? I think the attitudinal surveys are less than perfect, but at least they give us some timeline. And the general percentage is about 10% of Americans agree with 6 of 11 questions that are sort of stereotypes about Jews and power, Jews and money, Jews and clannishness, and so forth. But usually, again, they're not in the context of looking broader over time or comparison with other groups. So, when I think about it, I think there are other things to consider as well. And I still think, despite there are some challenges and things I'm deeply concerned about, which I will talk about in a little while, I still think we're undeniably at one of the best times historically. Think back 20 years. Okay, what was happening in 2000? People were saying that anti-Semitism was dead. And the case that they made was basically two-pronged. And I thought, it had some merits, but I thought it was a little bit distorted too. So the merits of it, the major debate in the Jewish community 20 years ago was not anti-Semitism, it was intermarriage. So that's an indication that Jews were being loved to death. It wasn't like, the decades before that people wouldn't marry a Jew or have a Jew in their family. Nobody really, had that much of a big deal about it. Jews were allowed in people's family. And the second thing that happened that year is that Joe Lieberman is running as the vice presidential candidate, and there was very little anti-Semitism except for some anti-Semites on the web, a small group who that's what they do. Of course, they're going to use new material. But the debate in the Jewish community is anti-Semitism is dead. Look, everything's fine, which I thought was, historically ignorant. 2 years later, when the peace process collapses, the Second Intifada starts, you have attacks on Jews in Europe, people were saying anti-Semitism is now like the 1930s. Well, neither of those things are true. It was not true in 2000 that it was over, declare victory and go home. And it's not true in 2002 that we're back to the 1930s. Yeah, so you look at a larger lens. I look at my parents' and grandparents' generation when there were quotas that kept Jews out of colleges, barriers to all sorts of inclusion in society. That was functional discrimination based on anti-Semitism that was institutional. So my kids don't, when we talk about that historically, they have no reference point, thank God. Intermarriage is still a good barometer of how Jews are accepted in society. And if you want to look at something comparative, look at something comparative to the situation with Lieberman in 2000. I would ask you to imagine, look at the Democratic primary. You had Steyer, Bernie Sanders, and Bloomberg, all Jewish, very little, if any, pushback at all. Imagine if among that field of Democratic candidates for president, you had an observant Muslim, or you had a transgender person. Could you imagine the different types of reaction? So that's one way of looking at gauging anti-Semitism. But we still have things to worry us. And if you go back to 1999, and we all think about Pittsburgh, that's not new. We had 1999 Buford Furrow, who went into the JCC in LA and shot it up and wounded 3 kids and killed a Filipino postal worker. We had the shooting of the guard at the Holocaust Museum, the shooting of non-Jews in an attack on Jews in Kansas City. We had the Tree of Life Synagogue and the Poway Synagogue too. And as I mentioned before, when I think about the ideologies that are spurring this, I also include things like the El Paso shooting, even though it wasn't thought about with Jews. The point is that one person can create horrific horror. And what's the relationship when one person decides to act one day or not to the larger picture of how we think of society and the level of anti-Semitism? Some of it is it reacted to? Do leaders speak out against it? What are the church leaders and others do? And I'm sorry for the fax machine. But that'll actually we'll go off in a second. So the point is, do we look at it as something that's on the extreme or something in the mainstream? And one of the analogies that I historically use, and Margie knows this too well, is from a friend of mine named Ken Toole, who was very involved in fighting the militias in Montana in the mid-90s. And he spoke about the militias that were organizing them. They came out of an anti-Semitic movement, by the way, at least in leadership. But he described it as a funnel moving through space. And what he meant in his community, and there was a small community of Jews in Montana, there was a rural community. He meant that they were sucking people in by mainstream issues to the wide end of the funnel. And as they got sucked into the funnel further, they were exposed to conspiracy theories. And of course, inevitably, as they got sucked further into those funnels, they got exposed to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And out of the small end of the funnel popped people like Timothy McVeigh, who are animated, gave their whole identity over to that fight. And the beauty of Ken Toole's model is that it suggests that the more pressure there is on the wide end of the funnel, the more likely you're going to have people popping out of the small end of the funnel. And I thought that's a very useful way of thinking about the world and the pressures on terms of at least anti-Semitic acts. So my concern is really about how anti-Semitism plays out in a binary world where the us versus them is being mainstream, because, to use Toole's model, will push more people at the lip of the funnel. And that's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about the rhetoric that comes out of Donald Trump, to be frank about it. My friend Sam Friedman, who teaches in the journalism school at Columbia, is writing a biography of Hubert Humphrey. And in his archival research last summer, he came across a quote from Gerald L.K. Smith that some of you who are students of anti-Semitism will know. He was a big-time anti-Semite promoter of anti-Semitism, contemporaneously with Hubert Humphrey's liberalism in the mid to late 40s. And there was a term that Walter Winchell supposedly used to describe Gerald L.K. Smith. He said he was promoting patriotism. And I thought that was a very useful construct. It was defining patriotism as requiring hating the other. And we can find examples of that in some of what we're seeing around us today, starting with the Mexicans as rapists and the suggestion that Muslims have to register. And there are some fine people among those with tiki torches, Confederate flags, and swastikas. Whatever the intent, this is mainstreaming hatred, and white supremacists, there's clear evidence that they feel empowered, because what could be more mainstream than the president saying things that resonate with their view of the world? So at Charlottesville, why did those folks there, some of those fine people, say Jews will not replace us? Well, the easiest explanation, and by the way, I'll send people a link. I have an old book from 2006 that's on my personal website, a PDF, and it goes into this in greater detail. I'm happy to have you, as a gift. But the basic point was that the vilification of minorities by white supremacists is really their emotional core, but the intellectual core is the anti-Semitism, because they have to deal with this disconnect. They believe that they are superior to people of color. And if you think about it, if you see the world this way, and you believe you're losing this battle, that we're going to be a majority non-white society in 2050, that there are things to support people of color, affirmative action, and so forth. How could it possibly be that people that are superior are losing to people who are, by their definition, inferior? And it has to be, again, that there's somebody putting their thumb on the scale. Jews, conspiring to harm Jews, explaining what goes wrong in the world. Okay? So the Pittsburgh shooter, Bowers, remember at the time that President Trump was talking about invaders coming over the border, he thought he had to act to stop the invaders. Compared to the guy in El Paso who figured, okay, I'm going to stop the invaders directly, he was able to think one step back and say, well, it's these evil Jews that are making this possible. And this Pittsburgh Tree of Life had a highest event. So target Jews, but for the same, principles. One other concern at the moment, too. I firmly believe that to combat anti-Semitism or any form of hatred, one of the necessary preconditions, strong democratic institutions. And I'm worried. I'm worried about the implications of our present moment. I think our democratic institutions are getting stress tested. The analogy I sometimes make is to infrastructure. Infrastructure on a highway or so forth could look fine, but if you look underneath it, it may be corroded until one day it's self-evident what the problem was. That may be happening with our democratic institutions to a degree, and I'm worried about attacks on the judiciary, on political enemies, including those who are concerned about refugees and Black Lives Matter activists and so forth, as treasonous, and the press as the enemy of the people. So to me, that's the major danger of anti-Semitism today. It's the empowerment of haters, whether intended or not by those in power. And if you ask me about what I'm concerned about most, it's not the things that people say about Jews, although that does concern me. But if you ask me what I'm most concerned about, it's the hateful attacks on others, on Muslims, on immigrants, on Black Lives Matters activists as thugs. Because the basic parameters of anti-Semitism is it thrives, even if you're looking at it for self-interest and parochially, it thrives in an environment where people are primed to see an us versus them, because in that context, anti-Semitism is a tried and true answer. So as human beings, we have to be concerned when other human beings are being vilified by basically based on who they are or differences that are perceived. But it harms us as Jews too. Couple of other points. I think in the Jewish community, one mistake we make when we think about anti-Semitism is to give a free pass to to people who may be on our side on the Israel question, and then just beat with the mallet people that are on the other side of the Israel question. I think we tend on both sides to ignore anti-Semitism and the promotion of it, at our peril. I give you examples on the left, but I'll give you an example, again, going back to the White House. I won't go into the details, but I was against the executive order on the campus that Donald Trump signed for reasons that I think it harms Jewish students. I think it's wrong for the academy. There's a whole bunch of reasons. There's a book about it you could read. But what really struck me at that moment of that signing ceremony is here were people that were supposedly concerned about expressions of anti-Semitism on campus. And what did they, do? They didn't take an opportunity to say, we're concerned about the attacks on Muslims, attacks on immigrants and so forth. Again, that was the opportunity to say, let's change the discourse. This is important for anti-Semitism. They didn't because of a position on Israel. Both sides do that. I think that's to our detriment. Secondly, I think we have to be smarter. I think the Jewish groups, by and large, do good work, ADL, AJC. But what are their gauges? And how do they think through what they're doing? And there's a tendency to think that what sounds good and feels strong might actually, work. And there's not that much evidence for many of those things. If you step back and think about it, hate in politics and how we think about that. It's not new. Hate in politics work. If it didn't work, Willie Horton or going back, hundreds of years, thousands of years probably, if it didn't work in politics, politicians wouldn't use it. So, you have to be aware of the historical lenses and then looking at ways to try to think a little bit about it better. I think that we also tend to stay in our buckets of who we're comfortable with when we're thinking about these issues. And again, it's important to have a larger lens and to look at what people are saying that may not necessarily agree with us, but to understand better how do you impact people with whom you have fundamental disagreements that may be open to some anti-Semitic and other racist arguments. So what's the nexus of the theories of hate and what those who combat hatred do, and what works on an individual scale and a societal scale? And that's part of the work that I'm doing and with colleagues. I mean, they're doing the bulk of the work. I'm just sort of the organizer at the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. But some of the things that I think the Jewish community has defaulted to, in addition to trying to give passes to people on the Israel question, also to me are somewhat suspect if we look at what we do know about hatred. We tend to default to Holocaust education as the be-all, end-all. Let's throw it at an anti-Semitism and that'll cure it. Well, Holocaust education is important. I'm a big promoter. I serve on a committee at the Holocaust Museum. But to think it's the logical default to combating anti-Semitism to me never made much sense. And I'll give you a couple of vignettes. Think about back in France in the early 2000s when you started seeing the attacks on the synagogues, and you had young Arabs and Muslims who saw images of Israelis with guns lording over their compatriots, their fellow Muslims or fellow Arabs. Do you really think that giving them a classroom lesson about Wannsee was going to change what they're seeing on TV, what they're hearing from their clerics, and so forth? 2001, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban. The language of the Holocaust was used to excoriate Jews and Israel. I would think, although I don't have the data to prove it by the anecdotal expressions, the people that were there and participated and started talking about ethnic cleansing and so forth, using the language from Holocaust education, turning it on its head. Anti-Semitism is consistent as a worldview, but as any hateful ideology, it's not just a matter of rational thought, but empowering ideas and emotions of identity. And the more we can understand that, the connection of social psychology and political science and so forth, I think the better off we'll be able to understand all forms of hatred and anti-Semitism clearly among them. At the extremes, people commit acts of violence and do so because they believe, as the statement I started off with John Ernest, is that it's self-defense. And we have to understand more about the motivations of people like that and how to reduce those types of incidents and how to reduce hatred more globally. But I think we do know one thing for sure, and that's when binary thinking becomes more fashionable and normative, especially when it's promoted by leaders. It's the culture in which anti-Semitism is most likely to rise. And let me stop there, and I'm eager to take your questions. And Margie, fire away.
Okay, thanks. There seem to be two questions having to do with the Palestinian and anti-Jewish part of Islam that have been posed to you. So do you think it's valid to talk about anti-Judaism and Islam like the replacement theology, or dehumanizing us into pigs and apes? And at the other end is, how do you explain the Arab-Israeli conflict to those who condemn Israel for repression of Palestinians but say they're not anti-Semitic?
Okay, well, the two good questions. First one is, I think if you look at the history of religion, it's, both, right? It's like not like either or. You'll find in Judaism, you'll find in Islam, you'll find in Christianity, both horrible things about other human beings. And you'll find some of the most empowering ethical, moral principles about loving their neighbor. And you find both. It's funny, I was talking to a reporter today, I was talking about some of the Facebook things and what should be online and what's not. And I sort of flippantly said, well, if you're going to ban the book that probably, you look at Jewish history, had the most responsibility for harm against Jews, and you wanted to take out that one book, ban the Bible. Of course you're not going to do that. So the practical answer is that any religion is what its practitioners say it is. They could find evidence for one stream or the other, the humanist or the vilification. And so I think that that's important to note, and to really work with the people that are faith-based, but see a common humanity, as opposed to using their religion to define others as less than human. So that's one question. The Israel, Palestine one, again, it's a much longer discussion. I'm happy to have it again with this group at some other point. It's very much detailed in the book, but I think that people get into these buckets again, literally tribal. And the problem is that there's a lack of imagination. I have evidence in the book of pro-Israel folks calling pro-Palestinian folks Nazis, and pro-Palestinian folks calling pro-Israel folks Nazis. There are some people in both communities that are clearly doing things that fit into the definition of hate studies, defining and demonizing another. But I think there are some, important models out there for how to have rational discussions, and to realize that they're not everybody who is a pro-Palestinian advocate, who may even be an anti-Zionist. And as much of a Zionist as I am, and as much of discomfort that anti-Zionism causes me personally, I also have the imagination to know that if I were, born to a Palestinian family that was displaced in 1948, I may not think the creation of the state of Israel is the greatest thing. And there are competing narratives in it, and I think you need to engage that. I have a section in the book which I really like, because in just a couple of paragraphs I was able to show both things and how to think about them. There was the PACB, which is the Palestinian Committee for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, had a letter a couple of summers ago to the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a group in American Indian group and also First Nations group that crosses the border from Canada to upstate New York. But their game, their national pastime, is lacrosse, and the Iroquois Confederacy was going to send a team to the international tournament in Israel. And PACB said, don't go, you're brothers like us, you're indigenous people, your land has been stolen by settler colonialists. It would be a betrayal of people that are indigenous like us. I contrast that with a blurb from Judea Pearl, who's a professor at UCLA. It's the father of Daniel Pearl, the journalist who was the Wall Street Journal reporter who was beheaded. And he said to people that claim that Israel is a settler colonial state, try to imagine, name me another society in which the language spoken there was before the, quote, current indigenous people, where the story, the national story of this group was told in literature and poetry for thousands of years, and they're yearning for a homecoming. Name another place where there's white settler colonialists, where the new towns are not named New York, New Berlin, New Warsaw, but the names known in biblical times. Then I have a quote from the scholar Seth Ezeka, who wrote a great book called Preventing Palestine, who basically says, you know, to choose one or the other is really just communal advocacy. And if you're really interested in history, you have to open your mind to accomplish both. One other example from the book, I sent and this is in a footnote at the beginning, I set out the stories of the Jewish narrative and the Palestinian narrative. And I had somebody that looked at it in draft who very wisely said, it's a really important choice, which narrative you put first. And I had to think about that. I had not thought about that before. And I ended up deciding to start with the Jewish narrative. But then I have a long footnote and said, well, imagine if I had started with the Palestinian narrative and then brought in Jews as secondary players to the story. Both of those things, the complexities, they have to be engaged. So that's what I would say to, to somebody who wants to delve into this, is to embrace the complexities and, what Margie?
Somebody said that there's audio but no sound, but I don't know what that.
I can hear you. Audio but no sound?
Yeah. Andrew Friedman, thank you for your telling us this, but I don't know what that means. Audio but no sound. I can't answer. Okay. If other people can't hear, just please, if I understand the question, please type in that you can't hear. All right. Oh, he meant to say video, but no audio. Okay. So I don't know. Okay. I
presume if people have questions, they could hear.
I have both. I can hear and see fine.
Great.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, Andrew. I can't help you. And Michelle Lieberman, who's on, will share will think why I should not be adminning this
no,
today's thing. Okay, sorry. Oh, and I'm still.
So ask some questions.
I'm sorry. Do you want next questions, Ken?
Yes. Yeah. So.
Okay. The two other questions have to do with the whole issue of kind of in the nurture nature department.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen Listman writes, you assert that it is instinctual to hate, but that is not the same as the instinct to categorize or differentiate. An alternative theory is that people have to learn to hate to turn the instinct to categorize toward positive or negative valences. How do you support the former and not the latter? But wait, there's more.
Okay.
If hate is brain-based to a certain effect, is compassion brain-based as well? If so, can people be cured or reprogrammed to increase compassion or decrease hate?
These are great questions. And, I think the evidence is, yes, it's to both, that it's both. I think that there's a an instinct in a way to see an us versus them. Again, think about it. Human brain was formed when we were living in, communities where you didn't know about the danger to your group by the group over the hill. So you did see an us versus them. There's evidence in social psychology that the connection to the in-group is greater than the fear of the out-group. But that's part of who we are. But in terms of how it manifests itself, I think there is a lot of it. You look at Sapolsky's webinar, and his writings suggest there are things that one can do to emphasize the positive things, the altruism, the ability to see our group as bigger, to let the groups with the strongest identities not overpower us. And there's some I have in the book about some of that scholarship as well. It's not preordained to see an us versus them, but there's a lot of evidence. I mean, in terms of the hating as a manifestation, but there's even evidence that people will find differences where we think that they're silly. I mean, there was a study years ago, Greek and Turkish Cypriots. You and I couldn't tell the difference between them. They can hardly either, except that one smokes one brand of cigarette, one smokes another. So we're always looking for those differences. The question is then how do we try to build a reduction of that? That's part of what the hate studies program seeks to do. I mean, there's some evidence that when people are in communities that are varied as opposed to homogenous, there's more altruism. I mean, I certainly anecdotally look at my own upbringing on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I went to a school that was 90+% Black and Puerto Rican. I didn't realize there were, major differences between, people other than who was Jewish and who was not Jewish. That was instilled into me. When I said it, I don't know if I ever told this, Margie, Yolanda Harrison, who was like my best buddy in Black in first grade. I said, one day I think I'm gonna marry her. And my parents said, she's not Jewish. They didn't say that she was Black, right? I didn't see that until I moved to Brooklyn. So that part of being in that environment, I think helps. But I think that, again, we default to too much of a belief in things without evidence. I mean, I'm a fan and a supporter of Facing History and Ourselves and other programs that are trying to teach about how, not to hate. But again, there's no, to me, overwhelming evidence long-term that they work. And then part of what I think our job is as academics and others is to help provide these answers. To me, there's much more unknown, and pulling together people who look at brain science, who look at evolutionary psychology, who look at politics, and to put them together and try to find the answers to some of these things. And that would then inform best practices among NGOs and governments and others. I think is an important mission, and that's part of what I spend my day thinking about.
Okay. Someone writes and is not trying to be antagonistic, but she
That's
writes
fine.
that in Judaism, no one is calling for the murders of the Amalekites, but in Islam, people are looking forward to genocide of Jews when the, I can't pronounce that, the Garquad tree will tell the Muslim, come, there's a Jew hiding
behind. Yeah.
Oh, you know this. Okay.
Yeah.
Come and kill him. I've seen this in YouTubes of imams all around the country, and it's definitely happening in the Middle East. So,
well, there's no question that there are some, imams who are spreading this, and it's being taught. But that again doesn't mean that one vilifies a whole religion because some people are picking out things. Or I could quote you other people, Irshad Manji, many others, who will pull from Islam uh, and not only condemn those types of quotes out, that are being used that way, but find the equally, even stronger parts in the Quran that talk about the positive things. Um, and you will find, I mean, again, um, I remember growing up and hearing in the Jewish community racism towards blacks. I mean, I presume people of a generation here remember their parents and grandparents referring to Schwarzes and so forth. That came in the community. I'm sure that there are people in the Jewish community from the pulpit in the 60s who were leaders in civil rights, and there were some who were promoting segregation, both using scriptures, talking about Ham and so forth, at least the people that were promoting slavery. So again, every tradition has its point. You may be well right that there are more clerics that we know about through memory and other platforms that we can see that are using this type of imagery. But again, it does not mean that we can just say that Islam is a hateful religion. As a matter of fact, you see people that are using those instances and trying to make that case, and ACT UP and other groups that to me are not only incredibly Islamophobic, but anti-democratic and dangerous, basically saying, again, conspiracy theories. Islam is trying to impose Sharia law in the United States. There were people there was actually a bill in Montana, as I recall, that people were, to outlaw Sharia laws because they want to impose it on the U.S. So again, there are people that will use it for nefarious purposes, but you find religion, and the point is to work with the people that are promoting, the anti-hate as opposed to the hate from their religion.
Okay. Next question.
Why don't you take a couple and combine them? And then what I would suggest is that this platform it archives questions. So if there's those that we haven't gotten to today, I'm happy to email answers because it captures emails to whoever, and everybody will get a follow-up email tomorrow with my email address. And if you want to continue the conversation, I'm happy to do that as well.
Okay, well, this seems like a great question to end with.
Okay.
What would be a 3-step process to combat hate on a daily basis?
3 steps. Okay. I think, thinking about
Congregants can, so
oh,
for the next 9 days.
Okay, so the 4th step is being very nice to the soon-to-be American rabbi.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a great question. I think to have to be an awareness of how we all get into these sort of buckets of us versus them and righteous, and to be aware of your thinking along those lines, and to really try to empathize and put yourself in the place of other folks. So that's generally. Specifically, this is one thing I know you disagree with, at least in our room in the back of the house where we watch TV frequently. But I decided a couple of years ago to watch Fox News a lot. You watch it a little bit with me, some, but the tolerances. I can understand because it's a variety of things. But the reason why I do that is I'm more likely to agree with what I see on CNN or see on MSNBC. I'm really disturbed by a lot of what I see on Fox. And so, again, there are some folks there that I really respect, that are rational, that I firmly disagree with their principles, but I see their humanity. And there are some folks who are just, terrible ideologues. And both sides on the cable news play this. Is Matt Taibbi, who's a Bard alum, like I am, wrote in a book recently, The Basic Business Model, as opposed to saying there's complexities, says that, there's a problem here, and it's their fault. And each side is doing it to the other. And I think we have to be aware of how people on both sides of that divide are thinking. So to be aware of that, I think it is an important thing. And then, you know, thirdly, in our personal lives, I mean, there's a lot that we can do. We can model for our children about interrupting hatred. I mean, it's not always easy to do, but I think it's an important thing to do. And even when we all stumble with it, I think it's important to keep trying. I think it's important to try to support, you know, organizations that do some of this work. I think those of you who may be connected with academic institutions, at least in my way, I think, again, we have too many questions and not enough in the way of answers about hatred. So to generate more of those answers and to ask the Academy to really be a partner with the rest of us as we do this. And I think, you know, there are many more things, but those are three that come to mind. And Michelle, if I think of more, I'm happy to have a conversation with you. And thank you for that.
Okay, well, those of you who had some other questions, Ken will be happy to answer them. I just want to end this by saying thank you, Ken, for doing this.
Thank you, Margie.
Thank you to everybody who logged on. I hope you learned something. I hope you have a takeaway in terms of both your knowledge base, but also in terms of how you respond and behave. Judaism always likes to say, deed not creed. So please do and continue to do acts of loving kindness. I just want to thank everybody for being here, and thank you, Ken, and thank you, Peter, and thank you to all my colleagues who made this available to your congregants. And with that, I think we will end, and Ken will answer all your questions that we didn't get to today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, Margie.
Okay, thanks.